My name is Gustavo de Carvalho, and I'm a senior researcher at the ISS Peace Operations and Peacebuilding Program. The title of this seminar, Looking Back, Looking Forward, South Africa in the United Nations Security Council, is in line with a recent report published by the ISS, produced by Priya Singh, one of the speakers in the seminar, and myself. A link will be included in the chat box of this seminar for you if you would like to have access to it. This is the first public online seminar the ISS is organizing in the period of a global crisis due to the COVID-19 pandemics. While there are many challenges we are all dealing with at the present, we also believe that this is an opportunity for us to increase our interactions, discussions, and ultimately assist policymakers and practitioners to find new and creative ways of strengthening global, regional, and national responses to human security challenges, with a particular focus on Africa. We're also of the view that through this platform, we can reach a wider audience than we normally have in our face-to-face seminars at the various ISS offices in Africa. I would like to acknowledge the presence of many familiar names, organizations, and friends from the ISS from around the globe. And I thank you for your attendance. Having the great caliber of participants like yourselves make us certain to have a great discussion during the seminar. Despite the calls for a global ceasefire by the United Nations Secretary General, Africa still faces critical human security challenges. At the core of these challenges is the role that can be played by the United Nations Security Council and its members as the most important global organ to deal with peace and security matters. While the Council has faced many challenges and deadlocks in recent years, the current pandemic is an exacerbating factor rather than replacing existing dynamics. South Africa, together with other African states, can be at the core of the changes required, not only as a key African member states, the chair of the African Union in 2020, but particularly as an elected member of the United Nations Security Council until December this year. Our research, which has been presented over the past years in several published papers, including the one that is theme of this seminar, shows that when working together, there is much African states can achieve. They can break deadlocks, provide independent views, and navigate in a complicated global and regional geopolitical systems. But in order to do this, it requires bold, coherent, principled, and clear approaches. In particular, our research has accordingly sought to provide first-hand, evidence-based analysis on the optimal role that South Africa could play. This was done not only by taking into account expectations for South Africa, which were many, but also by considering the margin of maneuver that the country has in pursuing its interests. Additionally, we sought to unpack how well the country could adapt, incorporate lessons learned, and effectively respond to the Council's taxing workload, which is relative to the country's diplomatic bandwidth, resources, and prior experiences in the Council. The recently published paper is part of the concerted effort that the ISS has conducted in the past few years to provide independent, targeted, and relevant research, advice, and analysis on South Africa's foreign policy towards strengthening peace, security, and development in Africa and in the world. This work has been made possible through the generous contribution from the ISS core partners, and in particularly through a project funded by the UK's Department for International Development. Today, we have two great speakers who share their views and insights on South Africa's past, current, and future role and their performance in the Council. The seminar will be dedicated to listening and responding to your comments, queries, and views after our speakers share their thoughts. First, we will have Priya Singh, who is one of the ISS brightest researchers and is also the main author of the paper in question. Priya has for the last decade worked on key elements of peace and security in Africa, with a particular focus on peace building, multilateral affairs, and South African foreign policy. He will provide views of our key findings on how South Africa has performed in the Security Council so far, and some thoughts on how South Africa can effectively navigate in the Council during the difficult times and sometimes strange times in 2020. Our second speaker will be Zahir Laher, who is the Acting Chief Director for the United Nations Political Peace and Security Desk at the South African Department of International Relations and Cooperation. He's currently responsible for coordinating South Africa's participation as an elected member of the UN Security Council for the period of 2019-2020. Previously, he served for 8 years at the South African Permanent Mission to the United Nations during the previous 2 terms of the country in the Council. Therefore, he has been one of the South African most prominent figures regarding the planning, preparation, and implementation of its membership. And we are very grateful, Zahir, that you've accepted our invitation to participate in this event. And we're looking forward to hearing your views and insights on this matter, which we know that keeps you preoccupied most of your time. This online seminar is similar to a face-to-face event, so usual rules will apply. But it is important to note from the start that considering this is a recorded open event, Chatham House rules do not apply. But I also wanted to share a few ground rules that will help the smooth flow of the seminar. First, each speaker will share his initial views for 10 minutes each, after which we will entertain your comments and questions. It is of critical importance that you keep your cameras off and audio muted during the presentations and comments. Nevertheless, there are a few ways in which you can indicate to me as the chair that you'd like to make a contribution. First, if you click on the participants logo in the bar at the bottom, you will be given the option on your right to raise your hand. Once I indicate who has the floor, the ISS administrator will activate your mic and request your camera to be turned on. Please be patient, as the activation does take a second or two. Second, if you click on the chat logo in the bar below, it will allow you to make a written comment to the entire group or to specific participants privately. Feel free to write your comments there at any time, which I will highlight to the speakers in due course. I will be keeping a speakers list and indicating who has the floor next. Notice if you have any technical queries, please message the ISS admin user directly using the chat function. We are expecting the seminar to last for around 1 hour, so please, in respect to the speakers and other participants, make your comments and questions as concise as possible. That being said, please allow me to once again to thank you for participating in this online event, and I'm sure we will have a great discussion in the next hour. Priya, you have the online floor.
Thanks very much, Gustavo. I'd also like to welcome everyone joining us this afternoon. As mentioned, this is quite an exciting and intimidating event, given that this is our first online seminar, and that internet reliability in South Africa has a rather notorious reputation for being quite temperamental, even in the best of circumstances. Given the 10 minutes time limits that I have for this presentation, I thought it best to not provide an overview of the entirety of our research, but to rather focus simply on the key findings and recommendations and how these in turn have been informed by particular developments and political dynamics on the Security Council throughout South Africa's current term. To begin with, however, I think it's important for us to first consider the particular significance of this period in terms of South Africa's foreign policy and multilateralism more broadly. Barring the immense immediate responsibilities and challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, the country's current term in the Council coincides with a critically important period characterized by an overarching need to renew, restore, and bolster South Africa's place in the international system as a capable, responsive, and committed regional power. The work of DIRCO's Foreign Policy Review Panel in early 2019, for example, rightly acknowledged that much more is needed for the country to live up to its potential and to play its expected role in Africa and on the world stage. South Africa's current term on the Council is therefore a prime opportunity for the country to restore its once deep reserves of political capital on the world stage by taking the lead once again in driving forward collective African peace and security interests, while further positively contributing to the upkeep of a global institutional order that has come under increasing strain in recent years. While our paper details these issues through a chronological overview and assessment of South Africa's effectiveness on the Council, by considering specific debates and agenda items, I will focus here instead on some of the overall observations and lessons. The first issue I'd like to highlight relates to the consistency of the country's various positions on the Council and how these have aligned to broader stated foreign policy priorities. At the center of this has been the country's ongoing prioritization of common African peace and security interests on the agenda of the Security Council. From country-specific deliberations to broader thematic debates, South Africa has generally managed to advance common African interests by pushing the Council to recognize and incorporate collective positions stemming from the African Union, whilst pursuing greater coherence and coordination with the two other elected African Council members, otherwise known as the A3. I think a standout example would be the role played by South Africa in response to political developments in Sudan throughout mid-2019, which neatly illustrated the country's commitment and general approach toward leveraging collective AU positions within Council debates. Additionally, South Africa's capability to seek out and leverage these kinds of common regional positions should not be taken lightly, given the particularly strained relationship in and amongst the Council's African grouping when South Africa first joined the Council at the beginning of 2019. In spite of this, however, South Africa has struggled on a number of Council files to drive through a common African consensus in a decisive and timely manner. Developments around elections in the DRC in early 2019, for example, was a critical early test for the country, and one in which many international stakeholders felt that South Africa did not play an adequate role. More recently, divisions amongst the A3 on Libya has also been indicative of the challenges of achieving this kind of unity. Additionally, the country has struggled a bit to communicate and act on a clearly defined and hierarchical set of priorities as part of its overarching strategy on the Council. While there has indeed been very useful documents and statements from key DIRCO officials, these have not always been uniformly applied or referenced throughout the country's current term, and has created some confusion, particularly between Council actions in New York vis-a-vis other relevant foreign policy actions directed through Pretoria. Secondly, South Africa's 2019 Presidency Month was a particular highlight in which we can assess the country's overall performance on the Council, particularly on a number of key thematic issues. Again, time doesn't permit me into going into detail on the technical chairing-related responsibilities, which we discuss in our paper. But from a thematic perspective, October 2019 was a particular highlight with regards to the UN-AU Partnership on Peace and Security, issues surrounding the predictability and sustainability of AU-led peace support operations, as well as the Women, Peace and Security agenda. While South Africa's role in championing the unanimous adoption of Resolution 2493 on Women, Peace and Security is arguably the most visible engagements of the country's presidency month, significant contributions were also made through leading the 13th annual joint consultative meeting between the UN Security Council and the African Union's Peace and Security Council. From a symbolic point, at the very least, it should be remembered that South Africa championed a closer council-to-council working relationship during its prior council presidency months in October 2007 and again in April 2008, and that the country's lead role in championing the adoption of Resolution 1809 in 2008 essentially got the ball rolling, so to speak, on the kind of relationship that the two councils enjoy today. There were, however, a number of challenges relating to South Africa's ambitious approach towards this month. Many international actors felt that the agenda was already too packed and that the country could have played a more effective role by narrowing its focus. Moreover, the country's pursuit of pushing through another resolution on women, peace, and security was seen as particularly risky given the potential of member states such as the US to backtrack on previously agreed to language and consequently offset recent advancements of the women, peace, and security agenda. I apologize, there's a huge thunderstorm that just occurred right now. The third set of observations we highlight in our paper relates to the general orientation of South Africa's foreign policy positions on the Council and how the country worked across an increasingly polarized Council. We observed, especially during the country's first 3 months, a tendency amongst numerous stakeholders to want to define South Africa as belonging to or siding with one particular camp amongst the Council's 5 permanent members, and particularly the divisions that cut across the US, UK, and France in opposition to Russia and China. Throughout the course of 2019 and early 2020, however, we can see that South African foreign policy positions became increasingly more nuanced and independent from P5 dynamics. South Africa's positions on various files ranging from Venezuela to its position in an April 2019 open debate on sexual violence and conflict, to its pursuit of Resolution 2493 on women, peace, and security, amongst others, underscores the country's ability to adopt and defend bold positions, where a more neutral or uncontroversial stance could otherwise have been an option. The fourth and final set of recommendations I'd like to put forward for discussion relates to South Africa's institutional memory. Having served as an elected council member in 2007 and again from 2011, the country does indeed possess certain advantages over other elected members unfamiliar with the complex and taxing processes, debates, and general workload of the council. The flip side of this, of course, are the greater expectations on South Africa to capitalize on this institutional memory and to more effectively make use of its current term. One particular issue we observed in this regard is the increasing openness and willingness of South African foreign policy officials to engage in robust debates with civil society and media on a wide range of issues concerning the country's positions on the Council, other multilateral bodies, as well as the country's international affairs in general. And I do think that having Zahir here today is testament to this. Of course, this is not to say that everything is perfect. There are still a number of challenges that the country needs to grapple with over the coming months and beyond. From considerable domestic, political, and economic pressures to growing international divides and lack of consensus on the most pressing peace and security concerns, to the massive impact of the current COVID-19 pandemic, South Africa's next 9 months in the Council will not at all be easy. Recent Council deliberations on simply recognizing the COVID-19 pandemic as a threat to international peace and security clearly illustrate some of the deep-seated political challenges and divides that need to be overcome. For these reasons, the country will need to carefully manage and balance its various multilateral commitments against the backdrop of public sentiment that demands the focus of government officials on domestic priorities. More importantly, however, will be the need to justify why such multilateral appointments are so critically important during times such as these, and will accordingly need to be prioritized over the next 8 or so months. Additionally, South Africa's current role as AU chair needs to be strategically leveraged in Council engagements moving forward, particularly as this relates to making tangible gains on issues including the UN-AU partnership, the sustainability and predictability of financing for AU-led peace support operations, as well as the AU's Silencing the Guns initiative. And finally, December 2020, which will duly serve as South Africa's final month of its current term on the Council, as well as the second time that the country assumes its role as Council President, needs to be very carefully prepared for months in advance. This month could ideally serve as the capstone of the country's current term, lay the groundwork for its successor in 2021, and serve as the basis for the country's ongoing global commitments beyond 2020. Thank you. Back to you, Gustavo.
Thank you very much, Priya, and I think you really captured many of the messages that we've tried to share in our reports that were recently published. And I wanted to highlight two issues that you presented there, Priya. One is the importance of the role of the A3, of the three African members in the UN Security Council, which I do think is not something that we should take lightly. We've seen in 2019 the largest number of joint statements and joint positions taken by the A3 in one single year is in a long time. And that is not an easy process to do. African member states, despite having common identities, also have a lot of differences in the way that they present their positions and efforts. And that in particular showed that in a space where the Security Council is so divided in so many issues, the times in which the A3 showed coordinated positions was one of the areas that we've identified as an important area to consider. We know there is a different A3 countries that are part of the Security Council this year, with Tunisia and Niger replacing Equatorial Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire, but that is certainly an important process to think of. But the final comment I wanted to make in relation to your regards, Priya, is the issue around the presidency month in December this year. And the critical importance from now, April 2020, that we have on assessing and thinking not only what we will be doing as a country in December 2020, but also what will be the legacy of South Africa from January 2021 forward. It is critical not only in terms of the areas in which the Council will continue having its discussion, whether South Africa will be replaced by Kenya or Djibouti in the elections for non-permanent members in June, but also how South Africa will engage with the wider peace and security matters within the United Nations, in line with some of its ongoing priorities, whether it's on women, peace and security, youth, peace and security, but particularly on areas in relation to the future of peacekeeping in a space where we're most likely going to see a global recession and potentially more pressure in terms of funding of United Nations peacekeeping operations, but also engagements with the UN peacebuilding architecture, the Peacebuilding Commission, the Peacebuilding Fund, and historically important issues for South Africa, such as preventative diplomacy, mediation, and even security sector reform. With that being said, Zahir, you have the floor. Okay, while we wait for Zahir to reconnect, and I'm putting someone on the spotlight now. I see that we have some colleagues from the South African mission in New York that are part of these events, and maybe I would use this couple of minutes until we reconnect Zahir, and maybe ask if any of you would like to make or have an initial reaction to the comments that have been made by Priya and myself. And then in the meantime, we will try to get Zahir back in line. Perfect. So Martinez will share some comments from his side. Martinez is the political coordinator of the South African Permanent Mission to the United Nations based in New York. Martinez?
Thank you, Gustavo. Hope you can hear me, and thank you, Priyal, and thanks for the opportunity. I think it'd be good to hear from Zahir, but just in the meantime, while you're trying to connect with him, thank you again for the opportunity to share in the report and to discuss the report. I think it's a very useful opportunity to take stock, to see how we have been doing, to hear the comments that's out there. In terms of the perceptions, because I think a lot of what one does in the council is hidden away, and the perceptions sometimes dictate as to how people perceive South Africa to have done or not, or how we performed or not. I think the report that you and especially Priyal have done, that it's a very good, it gives a good overview of how we've tried as South Africa to stake a claim for not just the country, but the continents in the council, which is a very difficult task, and you're up against so many different forces. But I think we've had a good team together. We had good coordination, and we've really put in a big effort in trying to pull together with the other African members on the council in trying to address some of the pertinent issues that we are facing as a continent today. So, but I'll leave it up to Zahir to go into the substance and to give you the background, and also to provide the assessment from our side and some comments on what you've said. But I think, Priyal, you've captured very well in terms of what the difficulties and the dynamics are in the council. So let me give it over to Zahir. I see he's online. So Zahir, I've jumped in and I've jumped a little bit. But let me leave it over to Zahir.
Thank you, Martinez, for coming in. You should have just continued. Just saved me the burden of going on. But let me continue. Firstly, I want to thank ISS and you, Gustavo and Priyal in particular, for convening this meeting and for providing us an opportunity to engage with you on South Africa's term in the Security Council. We welcome all of your interest in our work as a member of the Council, and we hope that everyone is keeping safe during this difficult time. As we have indicated previously, we value our interactions with civil society and members of the public, as this provides us an opportunity to assess our performance as an elected member of the Council. Over the last 15 months, we've had several interactions of this nature, and the feedback we get from these discussions are very useful for us, and they're a valuable addition to our work. In particular, the engagements we've had with ISS after the first 12 months of our term, the first 6 months actually, of our term, and now after the first 12 months, is particularly useful as it brings together the different civil society organizations that work on these matters. We wish to commend the ISS on the publication of your research report, and thank you, Priya, for going through its key findings. And we're glad that you were able to engage with scholars in South Africa, New York, and others on your findings. Colleagues, since being elected to the Security Council by members of the General Assembly, South Africa's first year on the Council has continued to be guided by the theme for our term, which is continuing the legacy, working for a just and peaceful world. This is a theme that aims to continue the legacy of former President Nelson Mandela, as we were elected to the Council in the year in which we commemorated the centenary of his birth. But the theme also aims to continue the legacy of what we began during South Africa's previous term. South Africa is on the Council, as you're aware, for the third time within years. This gives us a very unique opportunity to implement and build on the previous advances that we started in our previous term, such as UN-AU cooperation, as well as Women, Peace and Security, the Women, Peace and Security agenda. This is something that elected members often find ourselves at a disadvantage, in that in the very short period of 24 months that we serve on the Council, we may begin initiatives and we may work on certain issues, but once we leave, there are new members that come in, and there's no one then to take on the baton of continuing the issues that we may have initiated. So this for us to serve so soon after our previous 2 terms allows us this opportunity to continue where we left off. As we look back on the term over the last 14, 15 months or so, we note that, as expected, there are some issues where the Council is active on and has been able to take action, including support for political processes, primarily through UN special political missions, deployments of peacekeeping missions, the implementation of sanctions, etc. These are often cases where the Council is united and able to act. There are matters, however, where the Council has been less effective. These are files where the Council is often paralyzed due to lack of unity. On some of these files, such as the Palestine-Israel matter, all the Council does is meet monthly without meaningful action. We have found that the Council is more divided of late, especially in areas where the permanent members have a direct interest. The divisions have intensified, leading to more protracted negotiations and weaker outcomes as the Council finds it difficult to find consensus, or at the very least, the minimum number of votes for decisions to be adopted. In the last year, we have seen increased geopolitical tensions and an emerging practice of triggering votes on resolutions that are not expected to pass, even before we vote on outcomes. Even before the meetings take place, we already know that these resolutions are not going to be adopted because of the divisiveness on these particular matters. Almost to prove a point, these matters are put to a vote. Thus, we have found that even on issues where there was consensus previously and where there were common ground, such as on humanitarian issues, these have become increasingly more politicized and are becoming much more difficult to find agreement on. We've seen that over the last few months, particularly on the matter of Syria. These divisions have also shown the glaring weaknesses and limitations on the Council in its current structural configuration to deal with global challenges and threats to international peace and security. In these cases of division, especially amongst the P5, the role of elected members become all the more important. As elected members, we are less encumbered by our ideological differences or national interest. We serve on the Council, or at least in South Africa's case, because we believe that we have the ability and desire to make a contribution to the maintenance of international peace and security. This is a requirement, as most of you are aware, in terms of Article 25 of the UN Charter for elected members to serve on the Council. As an elected member during our term, we have forged links with the other two African countries serving on the Council, the so-called A3, which in 2019 was made up of Cote d'Ivoire, Equatorial Guinea, and of course, South Africa. And this year comprises of Niger, Tunisia, and ourselves. We've also worked with other developing countries that are part of the non-aligned movement, and we have attempted to work with other elected members of the E10 formation, the elected 10 members of the Council. We have thus made a concerted effort to play a bridge-building role where there have been disagreements. In playing this role, we have strived to illustrate our independent foreign policy based on our values and objectives of making a positive contribution to global peace and security. We believe that you will find through our statements and voting record, and then I think the ISS paper does that, that we have displayed an independent approach that is not aligned to any of the blocks that emerged in the Council. We believe this must be the role of elected members. Elected members who consistently align themselves with a particular ideological bloc without applying a value-based approach on the issues that the Council deals with runs the risk of becoming irrelevant and merely a rubber stamp for the bigger powers. Colleagues, looking at the specific files on the Council that South Africa has been working with, we have, together with the African Council members, attempted a leadership role on the African files dealt with by the Council. In this regard, our approach has been to ensure that the Council supports regional and continental initiatives to resolve conflicts. We continue to advocate for closer cooperation between the UN and the AU. In this regard, we are working on implementing the commitments made by the Security Council in its previous resolutions, including the resolutions we piloted during our previous terms, Resolution 1809 and 2033, which focuses particularly on closer cooperation between the UN and the AUPSC, or the UNSC and the AUPSC. In October 2019, to give practical manifestation for our commitment to foster this closer cooperation, South Africa led the Council delegation to the annual joint consultative meeting between the Security Council and the AUPSC, where the two councils continue fruitful discussion on issues of mutual interest. We are continuing our engagement with the PSC in Addis, as well as with all Council members, to ensure that we are able to procure sustainable and predictable funding for AU-led peace support operations authorized by the Security Council. Colleagues, Priya has touched a little on our presidency of the Security Council, but I just want to mention that we used during our presidency lives during October were events initiated or advanced These included the debate on peace and security in Africa, looking at youth, the role of youth towards silencing the guns by 2020, as well as the debate on the centrality of preventative diplomacy, conflict prevention and resolution. And we also participated and were part of the Security Council visits to Juba, South Sudan, and as I indicated, the AUPCNS. The main deliverable emanating from our presidency was the unanimous adoption of Resolution 2493 on women, peace and security. For us, this resolution was key because it recognized that as we approach the 20th anniversary of this landmark resolution this year, that we need to look at the gaps of implementing we need to look at the implementation gaps and the commitments that we had undertaken to fulfill. Women continue to be marginalized in peace processes and also continue to be amongst those most affected by the devastating consequences of conflict. The unanimous adoption of this resolution was significant as it reflected the consensus that we were able to get back to after the failure of the Council to have consensus in the April 2019 resolution on sexual violence in conflict. Then I thought I should just touch on, before because in the limited time that we have, I should look at the remaining period of our term. I'm sure there are many issues relating to our past experience that will emanate in the discussion. But as we look at the remaining period of our term, we will continue to work with all council members, particularly the A3, or now as what has become common. Am I still there? I'm not sure if I've disappeared.
You're still there.
Okay, because I see the videos disappeared. That's fine. What has now become the A3+1 as St. Vincent and the Grenadines has aligned itself with A3 statements as part of the wider diaspora. We'll continue to work with the A3+1 as well as the E10 to ensure that the Council is able to effectively carry out its mandate fairly and without favor. In this time of uncertainty, as nations across the world, developed and developing, grapple with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, it is difficult to predict how this will impact global peace and security. South Africa has been actively participating in various multilateral tracks dealing with this matter, including at the World Health Organization, the UN General Assembly, and also at the Security Council. On 9 April, the Security Council, as you're probably aware, received a briefing from Secretary General Guterres on the impact of the pandemic on international peace and security. At the meeting, South Africa recognized the devastating impact the pandemic is having on the world and commended, acknowledged, and reaffirmed the indispensable leading role of the WHO in dealing with this pandemic. We supported the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire to allow for focused attention towards mitigating the spread of the virus. We view this as a significant opportunity for countries in conflict situations to immediately cease all hostilities in the spirit of silencing the guns and to prioritize saving the lives of their people. South Africa also supported the call for urgent global action and solidarity, and we concur with the Secretary General that this is the time to strengthen the solidarity and not perpetuate divisions. We emphasize that it is imperative that the Security Council should continue to focus on matters that fall within its mandate, which include its response and necessary support to countries in conflict and post-conflict situations so that we can mitigate the security challenges and mitigate the impact of the pandemic. In this regard, we must focus on the challenges to peacekeeping missions, including the safety and health of UN staff, as well as the potential impact of the pandemic on gains already made in countries in transition, post-transition, and those preparing for elections. South Africa also highlighted the challenges of humanitarian assistance and unimpeded access to aid for all those in need. Important to reaffirm the Secretary General's call for waiving of sanctions that can undermine countries' capacity to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the call by the AU and SADC for lifting of economic measures. The immediate action to lift economic measures and waive sanctions is imperative in order to enable countries to access essential supplies to prevent the further spread of the pandemic. In this regard, processes of providing humanitarian exemptions within various sanctions regimes in order to allow authorities to adequately respond to the pandemic is paramount. Incidentally, this is a call that has become universally accepted. We've seen other would well take on this call. Currently, we are engaging with council members on an outcome, and we trust that the council will be able to agree on this. We've also ensured and called for briefers to the council in meetings to indicate the particular impact of the pandemic on specific conflict situations. The call for the council to deal with the pandemic should be something meaningful. It shouldn't just be a council outcome for the sake of it, but it should be based on meaningful action in particular situations, depending on how the pandemic affects those particular cases. Our next presidency, as Priya has indicated, will be, as I round off my intervention, our presidency will be in December 2020, which will be the final month, will be our final month of the council. For South Africa, it will be a convergence of 1, the chairing of the African Union, 2, the presidency of the Security Council, and 3, the final month of the ambition of the African Union to silence the guns on the continent by 2020. This would thus be an opportune moment for us to take hold and to hold high-level meetings that will focus on addressing the conflicts on the African continent. So we look forward to working with all of you as we prepare for December and the focus on specifically on conflicts on the continent. Again, I want to thank you for allowing us this opportunity and for this engagement, and we look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zahir, and for providing a very comprehensive overview on how South Africa has seen its own performance. And I'm very appreciative for you to provide us some views and thoughts in terms of what are the key dynamics and challenges that we are going to have in 2020, especially in line with the COVID-19 crisis. And while I give the participants some time to think about their questions, I've already received 2 questions via chat, which I'm going to be asking. And if you would like to make the question via audio, please just raise your hands. Once again, just click on participants, and there is a function to raise your hands. But I just wanted to make one brief comment that, Zahir, your presentation highlighted to me, which is how to navigate around a very divided and politicized council. And especially with the current COVID-19 crisis, we've seen more and more of these divisions. In our research, what we have identified is that playing safe in the council is not enough to be effective. We've seen that countries that do not take strategic risks, which many times may be taken as taking a controversial position, is a way in which countries can actually allow themselves to be more effective. So they have to take some of these strategic risks, but at the same time being able to balance those risks on the one hand and taking principled approaches, to the other hand, taking consensus building view, as you mentioned, Zahir. I wanted to first ask just a question that was asked by Aditi from Crisis Action, and I'm reading her question here, which is, I would be interested to get a better understanding of how South Africa is positioning itself on issues of sanctions renewals in the Security Council. In particular, the embargo on arms on South Sudan expires at the end of May. The peace agreement has only just been signed, and it's likely that the embargo will be lifted. Is it likely that the embargo will be lifted even though the country is still in a very fragile, newly post-conflict state? I will ask a second question now that was done by Peter Fabricius, and then I'll give the floor back, and I'll ask a third question from Rafael Marreto, which is a bit long, but I'll try to summarize it, and I'll give the floor back to Priya and to Zahir. The question from Peter asks, the Security Council seems paralyzed on responding to the coronavirus crisis. South Africa seems to have taken a view that this is not an issue that the Security Council, for the Security Council, as this would allow the P5 member to manipulate the situation. But Guterres now has said that the virus is a threat to international peace and security. So by implication, the Security Council should be taking more of a lead, surely. You said now that the Security Council should be meaningful. What does South Africa think the Security Council role should be in fighting the virus? And the final question I'm going to ask on this round is from Rafael Marreto. He asks a pragmatic operational question to you. In the last months, perhaps years, an unfortunate trend within many Security Council permanent members has been that African nations do need to become financially sustainable to operate peacekeeping operations. Within the Security Council, how is South Africa working specifically on this front, once most African nations have already heralded that they do obviously lack most of the necessary financial resources and capabilities for such endeavors? Many thanks for your attention. I will give the floor back now to Priya and Zahir, and immediately following that, I will have, I'll read the question from Kari. I have the raise from Ashish raised, and I'll allow the two to make, but now maybe if the two of you can make comments on those three initial questions.
Thanks.
Zahir,
do you want me to go, or do you want to go, Priya?
Zahir, you can start, and then Priya can make some comments after.
Good. All right. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the questions. I'll start with them in the order that you asked them. Regarding Aditya's question, well, there's two parts to that. One, what is South Africa's approach to sanctions in the Security Council? And secondly, a very specific question pertaining to South Sudan. I'll start with the first. Sanctions, from our perspective, are a necessary tool. They are part of the Security Council's prerogative in terms of the UN Charter. And the Security Council should be free to use them when it is appropriate. But sanctions are not an end to themselves. Sanctions should be utilized to ensure that there are results, and they should be relaxed when the time comes. In that case, we've been supporting the recent trend in the Security Council to adopt benchmarks, which will allow countries to ensure to keep to certain requirements and achieve certain targets so that these sanctions can be relaxed. With regard to South Sudan in particular, the African Union has a particular position on this matter, and we have voted in accordance with that perspective. The A3, as you may be aware, has voted in this regard, where we have abstained from the resolutions pertaining to South Sudan. We do recognize the difficult and precarious state in which South Sudan is at this stage. We also are cognizant of the fact that we should not be taking any action which may undermine that precarious state that it's in. So, of course, we'll look at the resolution when it comes up for renewal, and we'll apply our minds and base our decision and our approach on its merits and also on the perspectives of the continent. But I wanted to give you a sense of how we have voted in the past and for what reasons we had abstained. We will look at it afresh as it comes up for renewal. Regarding Peter's questions on the pandemic, firstly, I think Peter, as I indicated, it's incorrect to say South Africa opposed the discussion on the matter. I'm not sure where that comes from, but it is incorrect. As I indicated in my intervention, South Africa fully participated in the meeting of the Security Council on this matter that took place last Thursday. South Africa is also actively participating in council negotiations on an outcome. What we have firmly indicated is that the council's work and council's engagement on the pandemic should be focused on its core mandate, and that is on international peace and security. The council, there are other parts of the multilateral system that should be dealing with the areas that it deals with. The pandemic in itself it has indicated the importance of multilateral collective action. And it is important that we strengthen all aspects of the multilateral structure and institutions to ensure that we are all able to collectively deal with the different areas within our competencies. With regard to the Security Council, I think the Secretary General has been very clear what he would want support on, and we have been very clear as South Africa in supporting that call. One, as I indicated in my, and to repeat what I said in my introduction, we support his call for a global ceasefire. In that case, as we approach the different conflict areas, where the Council will be meeting on Yemen, for example, lately, there has been a ceasefire agreed upon, and we would want to, in the context of the pandemic, and we would want to reaffirm that not just in Yemen, but in all other cases where there is conflict, we should adhere to the Secretary General's call so that we can allow the authorities to address the effects of the pandemic. We've also called for the easing of economic measures. And this, again, as I said, it's not just a call from ourselves, it's a call from the Secretary General. We've seen the foreign policy chief of the European Union and many others that have made a similar call. The Southern African Development Community has made that call for the easing of economic measures to allow countries to address the consequences of the pandemic. So to conclude on that point, just that the Council should be addressing issues pertaining to the impact of the pandemic on international peace and security. Then moving on to the last question, I presume it particularly relates to the challenges faced by African countries in particular to resource African Union missions that are authorized by the UN Security Council. This is an issue that we have championed and raised in the Council since our first term in 2007, 2008. In 2008, under our presidency of the Council adopted Resolution 1809, which called for flexible, predictable, sustainable financing. And it created avenues to explore how this can be done. This issue has evolved over the last 12, 13 years, but unfortunately, we have not been able to reach agreement on how that can be done. We will continue efforts to engage with the Peace and Security Council in Addis, as well as all Council members, particularly the permanent members, to ensure that we are able to reach agreement on that matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Priya, please go ahead.
Thanks, Gustavo, and thanks, Zahir. On Aditi's question, I think I'm not going to add too much to what Zahir's already mentioned, but if I can just pick up on the second and the third question. On the COVID response, I think the biggest issue right now is, just to add to what Zahir was saying, I'm sorry, I hope you can hear me. There's a huge storm at the moment. But for me, the biggest issue here is also the polarization, the polarized Security Council, and the kind of self-serving political narratives among certain permanent member states, and how the Security Council can achieve a unity and a consensus on recognizing COVID-19 as a threat to international peace and security in a way which doesn't further fragment and divide the Council and push it into a further stagnation on taking decisive action on the ways in which the pandemic might go and influence and exacerbate certain conflicts around the world, or conflicts on the agenda of the Security Council. On the issue of the financing side of things, I didn't delve too much into those questions in my presentation, but we do cover it quite a bit in our paper. But just one issue that I didn't mention in too great detail was, I think the biggest challenge confronting South Africa right now is achieving also consensus at the AU, or from an AU perspective, on what exactly to do with the AU's Peace Fund. How best can the Peace Fund, the AU's Peace Fund, be utilized? Because I think that's actually a huge sticking point now. And it's used by actors at the UN to kind of curtail further discussions on supporting African Union, better supporting the African Union in financing its peace support operations. So I think if we can achieve clarity and consensus in exactly how the AU Peace Fund will be utilized, whether it will be directed solely for peace support operations, or whether we can agree that it'll be used for things such as mediation and peace building and so on. I think that's an issue that needs to be solved so that conversations can at least in earnest be kickstarted again at the Security Council. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Priya. I'm going to be reading now the question from Kari Alanko, the Finnish ambassador to South Africa. I will give the floor to Ashish Pradam from the International Crisis Group in New York. But I also wanted to use the opportunity as chair just to make a brief comment when it comes to financing. Because while it is an issue that has somehow created many challenges to the UN-AU relations debate within the UN Security Council, it became increasingly a bilateral matter with the United States in recent years. What the A3 done last year, I thought it was quite an important move that beyond the discussions in New York and in Addis Ababa, the A3 also directly engaged with the Department of State and with Congress in Washington, D.C. And while I don't think that this is an issue that was going to be resolved anytime soon, I think it's very important to identify what narratives that needs to be provided and what spaces in which the A3 countries have to be able to address. But it also becomes increasingly clear that that relationship between the UN and the AU has to be strengthened not only at the level of the United Nations as a whole, but particularly how the A3 and the AU Peace and Security Council strengthen the relationship and is able to find a common ground when resolving the issue on financing. That being said, I'm going to read the question from the Finnish ambassador to South Africa. His questions are, what about the relationship between the Security Council and the World Health Organization? The WHO is a UN agency without real power. Is the UN response still left to the WHO? And maybe is this one challenge here of fragmentation of the UN system? I'm reading then the question from Benoit Pellister, who asks, hi everyone, the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to lead to a global recession, resulting in further cuts to peace operation funding. Can this possibly accelerate and consolidate an African peace and security architecture? And what would South Africa's position what would be South Africa's position in this? Benoit is a strategic advisor for the Challenges Forum. And that being said, Ashish, if you'd like to unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Hi, Gustavo. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Great. Listen, thanks so much for organizing this. And it's, I think we've talked about this, having this discussion for a while. And despite the COVID pandemic, I'm glad that we're able to do this stock taking exercise. And I think I also sort of commend colleagues at DERCO, colleagues at the mission here for being centrally involved in this, because I don't think it's necessarily par for the course for all of the elected members on the council. So I think there's a genuine sort of value to this, and you guys did such a good job of this same sort of discussion last summer as well, which we were glad to be involved in. And I should say, my colleague Piers is also on the line, so he might chime in with any views. But just from the New York side, I think a couple of reflections. Sorry, partly based on last year and the experiences of South Africa at the council in the first year of their term, and some thoughts on where things stand now. I think in the first year, especially in October and leading up to that, we saw some pretty historic and unprecedented things, as you guys have mentioned. Both in terms of the the joint statements from the A3, the joint advocacy in Washington that South Africa really led the charge on, which is really impressive to see. But also, I think maybe some growing pains, and the WPS resolution that was reached. I didn't follow it too closely, but I do understand there were some difficulties in getting to that final final step. So, I think some of that is natural. But, looking at where things stand now, and, I think South Africa has in some ways come under the microscope on the position on the COVID resolution. I think some of that might be a slight sort of, misunderstanding of dynamics on the council a little bit as well. But, I think, among the elected members at least, I think South Africa's taken a position which, which is asking more questions of the other elected members, and I think from our perspective, pushing for certain things like, just like Zahir mentioned, on peacekeeping, on peace processes, things that the council has an actual role in. But somehow, I think there's a bit of a dissonance in terms of those positions and how, what the perception is on the outside. And I was, really found it really fascinating to hear about the A3+1 concept as well, because I think, sometimes what happens is, partly unfairly, there's a lumping together of South Africa in certain camps. And this is one of the first discussions we had with colleagues here in New York after the election in 2018 to the council, was how South Africa gets lumped into one camp or the other. There's never just South Africa's position per se. So I think that's continues to be a very difficult piece of the puzzle for colleagues within the system to grapple with. And the final thing I'll say is on the question of December and the presidency. And I think our position in Crisis Group has been to urge a bit of caution in terms of how to approach that, because we've seen in previous years, as members have left the council at the end of the year, there's a time crunch that they run up against. And nowadays, members of the P5, among others, are well aware of that and willing to push the ante and raise the stakes and not concede things because they know there's a time crunch, as we saw with AU financing in Ethiopia's last month on the council. So, I think maybe, and by then, obviously, the U.S. elections will have happened. That might have a bearing on U.S. posture at the UN in that final month of 2020. So we've been sort of urging a bit of caution on that side as well. But otherwise, really happy to hear all of this stock taking and all of the thinking from the mission and from Durko as well.
Thank you so much, Ashish. And given the time, I won't allow any other questions to be asked at this stage. And I'll give the floor to Priya and to Zahir, if I think we still have him. Yes, we still have him here. But I just wanted to make a brief comment on the presidency month before I give you, Priya and Zahir, the floor. I think it's having the presidency month on the last month of their membership is quite a tricky one. Certainly, particularly countries that will remain in the Security Council, and we've seen that with the P5 many times, where issues can be just pushed to the next year and so on. But there is quite a unique opportunity for African member states this year, considering that we have Niger with the presidency in September, St. Vincent Grenadines, now around the dynamics of the A4 in November, South Africa in December, and Tunisia with the presidency in January. There is a really strong opportunity in coordinating positions and making sure that for a period of almost 6 months, African issues are well represented within the agenda of the Security Council. So by identifying a strategy that does not only look into the month of December in isolation, but really look into the dynamics of this later part of 2020 that really will create a lot of visibility for African issues, for us in our research is something that we're really looking with interest. So I will give the floor first to Priya this time, and then to Zahir. And if you can be concise, we have 5 minutes over time. We can still go another 5 to 7 minutes just to conclude, so that we can finish the seminar on time. Priya, you have the floor.
Thanks, Gustavo. Some really, really great questions came through. And of course, I can't answer all of them, but maybe just to pick up a bit on the issue of the World Health Organization. I think it's important for us to remember that the World Health Organization is a technical focal point within the UN system. the key advantage of the UN Security Council pronouncing on this issue is to really drive through and lay the basis for a sophisticated and necessary political response to the peace and security fallout from the crisis. And I think that's what's missing right now, and that's what the world needs right now. And also, I'm very interested to hear Zahir's thoughts on that as well. And then very quickly on the last point from Benoit, this is a great question. The economic fallout from the crisis and the impact that will have on funding for peace support operations, there's a huge question mark around that right now. I think we're in unprecedented territory, but I think a useful thing to keep in mind always is the fact that even today, the amount of money that is put towards peace building, peace support operations, peacekeeping is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of what countries spend in terms of their own military expenditure, in terms of their own national security. So let's just bear that in mind and say that I think there is still decent money out there that we can still prioritize the maintenance of global peace and security through multilateral peace support operations and so forth. And on that, I'd like to conclude and again, just thank everyone and thanks Zahir and everyone for joining us today. Thanks.
Zahir?
Thanks, thank you very much. And again, as Priyal said, great questions. I'll try and go through them one by one very quickly. With regard to the question from the Spanish ambassador regarding the WHO, there are different agencies, there are different specialized agencies within the UN that deals with different issues within their competencies. We need to ensure that each one of them, because this is a global issue that affects all of us in different ways. There's an impact, for example, on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, a drastic impact on the implementation of the SDGs. So how do we ensure that all parts of the UN system and the multilateral system as a whole, whether it's the G20 had an engagement the other day, as you may have seen in the media, and other parts of the multilateral world, is able to come together to address the challenges that we all face. It shouldn't be about undermining specific elements of that or one taking responsibilities of others, but each one has a specific role, and the Security Council's role is related specifically to peace and security and the impact of the conflict. And I'll come back to that in answering as I conclude. The question by the colleague Benoit about the financing, I think this is a very important issue, and it's a real serious challenge. Peacekeeping has already been under severe threat because of the diminishing resources that it faces, and now it will face even more of a threat. There's a few things that needs to be done. One, it's the importance of ensuring that regional organizations are able to play their role, and we've touched on that in our discussion on the role of the AU and the funding of AU missions. But it's also to ensure that we take a more holistic approach in terms of how we address conflict. The issue of deploying peacekeepers as the only solution to resolve conflict is something that we need to look at. The Security Council tends to do that perhaps more often than other ways of dealing with conflict, including addressing post-conflict issues or pre-conflict issues in terms of political processes, supporting mediation, etc. We have I think to some extent, is that we find that many of the conflict situations on the continent in particular or the missions are now beginning to look at post-conflict reconstruction and development issues. We see that in Darfur, we're seeing that in the DRC, we're seeing it in Mali and the CAR as well, where there are elements of post-conflict reconstruction and development. And we need to put resources and capacity into that aspect so that we reduce the pressure on peacekeeping itself. Then on the issues pertaining to, and I want to thank you, Gustavo and the colleague from Crisis Group, on the advice for December. I think this is useful, and these kind of discussions allow for that, for us to share experiences and comments and advice on how do we deal with some of these aspects. The one thing that I want to make clear about coming back to the issue of Security Council and the pandemic is that some of the challenges we face the colleague from Crisis Group raised the issue of the difficulties we're having with the negotiations on the outcome document, is that we've asked questions and we've raised issues. One of the issues that we've also consistently raised, and I raised it in my intervention, is that there are humanitarian exemptions when it comes to sanctions. Many of the sanctions regimes in place that the Council has adopted and put in place makes provision for humanitarian exemptions. So the institutional framework is, when countries apply for exemptions on the basis of humanitarian goods that needs to go in, there are restrictions and holds placed on those requests. And we are calling for those kind of exemptions to be fast-tracked, to be facilitated, and that unreasonable hold should not be placed on them, because countries are dealing with a global pandemic that we all need to rally around and try to assist countries. But to place unrealistic holds and restrictions when there are exemption procedures in place makes it very difficult. And we've been calling for that to be referenced in the manner in which the Council reflects on a response to the conflict. That's just one example of how the Council can play a role. But thank you very much. This has been a very useful engagement. We look forward to further engagements of this nature, and we appreciate the criticism and the analysis that's given, because it enriches our own understanding. We are doing our constant stock taking on our work, and engagements of this sort with experts that are looking at these issues on a day-to-day basis does help us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zahir and Priyal. And once again, I would like to thank all of you for attending this event. As we mentioned in the beginning, it's the first time we're doing this kind of open seminar through an online basis. And certainly it confirms to us that there is much that we can do, even though all of us, if not most of us at least, are having degrees of restrictions of movement and be able to deal with the social distancing that the currency crisis, the current crisis requires. So once again, thank you very much for all of the participants. Thank you so much, Priyal, for sharing your thoughts and views. And particularly thank you, Zahir, for coming and joining us and having a very open approach and sharing a lot of South Africa's points of views and ideas around the South Africa membership in the UN Security Council. We will continue doing these types of events, not only on issues related to South African foreign policy, but in any of the other issues related to human security that is the core realm of focus of the ISS. Thank you once again. For those that are in Johannesburg or Pretoria, please keep safe and dry. The storm is very heavy. For those of you that are in other parts of the world, please keep safe in this period of the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you very much.